Good evening. I will now call the public portion of this meeting of the Standing Committee on Social Development to order. My name is Caitlin Cleveland, and I am the chair of this committee and also the MLA for Cam Lake. Today, committee is receiving a briefing on early learning and childcare in the Northwest Territories. Today's meeting is being broadcast and live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. I'd like to remind all members and witnesses to please direct all comments and questions to myself as the chair to help keep the meeting running smoothly today. Please wait to be recognized before speaking. I will now ask members to introduce themselves for the record, starting with the member to my left, the MLA for Montfleury.
Jane, we yell at them.
Oh, just wait, Jane.
One moment here.
Oh, okay. Jane Wayellen Armstrong, MLA for Montfleury. Thank you.
Lisa Semler, MLA Nuvik Twin Lakes.
Rocky Simpson, Hay River South.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Thank you, MLA O'Reilly. I will now turn it over to members joining us virtually. MLA Bonnet-Rouge.
Ron Bonnet-Rouge, Decho.
Katrina Knockleby, MLA for Great Slave.
Thank you, MLA Knockleby, and thank you to committee. We are pleased to be joined by the Honourable R.J. Simpson, Minister of Education, Culture and Employment, as well as officials from the department. I'd like to invite the Minister to introduce his witnesses and proceed with any opening remarks and also your presentation. Thank you, Minister Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me all right? Thank you for the opportunity to present on the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Agreement and Action Plan. Today I am joined by John MacDonald, Deputy Minister of Education, Culture and Employment, Shannon Barnett-Aikman, Assistant Deputy Minister, Education and Culture, Sam Shannon, Assistant Deputy Minister, Corporate Services. To my right, Shelley Kapralian, Director, Early Learning and Childcare, and Julia Mott, Senior Advisor to the Deputy Minister, and my Ministerial Special Advisor, Rana Sherrigan. Today's presentation will provide committee with an overview of the recently announced federal funding. The significant increase in federal funding will support commitments identified within the newly released 2030 Early Learning and Childcare Strategy, and will support this Legislative Assembly's priority to advance universal childcare by increasing availability and affordability. Madam Chair, I would like to ask Ms. Kapralian to deliver a short presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Simpson. Ms. Kapralian, please go ahead with your presentation.
Oh, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So if you don't mind to move to slide 2. The presentation this evening will provide an introduction to the topic of federal funding agreements we have with the Government of Canada to support development of the Territory's early learning and childcare system, with an overview of the funding provided over the 5 years of the agreement. Then we'll also look at how they'll support implementation of our 2030 Early Learning and Childcare Strategy, including highlights for the vision, areas of focus, and actions and targets. And then we'll speak to next steps. Thank you. Education, Culture and Employment has recently finalized 2 federal funding agreements with the Government of Canada to support our implementation of our 2030 Early Learning and Childcare Strategy. The strategy is an overarching document that speaks to commitments over a 10-year time frame, and the federal funding will support implementation of those and achievement of those commitments. The specific short-term actions that will take place over the next 2 years are reflected in the recently announced Canada-NWT ELCC agreement. And on the left on this visual, you can see the existing ELCC bilateral agreement, which has been in place since 2017-18 and was recently renewed for 4 years with a 1-year action plan. While the Government of the Northwest Territories does not own or operate licensed programs, we recognize that programs need to be community-driven and that where they're operated by Indigenous governments, nonprofit organizations, and family day home operators, those individuals and operators are in the best place to determine the needs that are in their communities, and so we want to work with them in partnership to implement this funding agreement. And where funding is one piece, and it's an important piece that we'll speak to this evening, there's also a need to recognize that change takes time, and we're going to be speaking to transformational change over time throughout this presentation, and that we need to work with partners in a collaborative way to move these initiatives forward. This will take intentional planning, and it will take programs working with us to support systemic change. Next slide. This slide provides an overview of the overall funding. Territorial funding is provided in green and is about 50 million. And then the remainder in blue is the existing early learning and childcare federal agreement for 4 years and 5 years of the new federal funding agreement, the Canada-wide agreement. And together that is a total of 114 million in the 5 years that we're talking about today, ending in 25-26. The focus of the funding largely in the new agreement and for the total of the 114 million is around high quality and affordable funding, affordable programs, with a significant investment in a childcare fee reduction subsidy to support affordability for families, and also to significantly invest in wage enhancements, recognizing that recruitment and retention is a challenge for programs. And so that is one area of significant investment to move towards closing the wage gap in the system. And then to support transformational change over time, we've built in 2 to 3 years, depending on the initiative within this agreement, so that we can work towards implementation in the 4th and 5th year. This investment does not reflect the investment that the GNWT has made in junior kindergarten, which is a total of an additional 81 million within the same time frame, approximately. Next slide. This slide speaks to the recently announced Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Agreement. It's a 5-year agreement with a 2-year action plan, and I'll speak to the specifics within those 2 years. And again, supports implementation of our 2030 Early Learning and Childcare Strategy. The action plan sets the stage towards first steps toward development of a national Canada-wide system, and the GNWT shares Canada's vision around accessible, affordable, high-quality early learning and childcare for all families and children that need it throughout the territory. Recognizing again that communities have unique needs and there's no one-size-fits-all approach, we want to work with communities and programs to better understand their needs and implement over time. In the last few years, we've heard from communities that there are different reasons why there might not be programming in the 10 to 13 communities that have not had it for children under 3 in the past. That includes population size, preference for a different form of childcare, a lack of infrastructure, difficulty operating a nonprofit program, and a lack of qualified or educated early childhood educators. And the Agreement and Action Plan lays out the work needed to address that, and also aligns with what we heard through our funding review and the engagement on development of the strategy, so the voices we heard across the territory. Next slide. First of several slides will speak to sections within the action plan. First being affordability, with 2 targets to achieve a 50% reduction in average childcare fees by December 2022. With the recent announcement, you'll note that we are achieving that earlier, and that again requires a partnership with our licensed programs to make that happen. An average, and we're just beginning to have those conversations with programs now. An average of $10 per day charged to families by 25-26 is the second target, and that is to be achieved by the end of the agreement. This is a focus on reduction in childcare fees for all licensed programs that offer care to infants and preschoolers, as well as out-of-school children ages 4 and 5. While this is a starting point for us as a system, working with the programs now and moving forward, it does not address the needs of affordability for 6 to 11, but that's something that we hope to look at over time. The total two-year investment in this area is estimated to be $12 million for 21-22 and 22-23. And while this is an allocation amount, and we recognize that it's late in the year to implement, those amounts will adjust, and we have negotiated a carryover amount with Canada to allow for that, so there is no loss of investment. Next slide. Accessibility focuses on the creation of 300 new childcare spaces, with a target of 75 new spaces in the first 2 years of the agreement, and then 75 spaces for each consecutive subsequent year to the end of the agreement. And we heard through the ELCC funding programs review that our operating subsidy, the early childhood program, is not meeting the needs of all programs. And so we will be looking at that and considering restructuring to better meet the needs of programs within that time frame, with the plan to implement in the 4th and 5th year of the agreement. In addition to support space creation, we have new childcare spaces funding, which is a startup fund to support programs in purchasing resources and materials. And we have an early childhood infrastructure fund, which has a territorial budget of $1 million, with an additional $280,000 provided in the existing ELCC agreement for this fiscal year. And as has been mentioned by our minister recently, there will be consideration for future years depending on the need. Next slide. Thank you. This slide speaks to the importance of inclusion, where all families and children are welcome, and all programs feel supported in meeting the specific developmental needs of children that come to their program. We will be completing an analysis of the current system and the inclusion supports that exist for families, looking at gaps and particularly focusing on vulnerable children or equity-seeking families. And then in follow-up to that evaluation or analysis, we will look at implementation of a plan to improve inclusion throughout the territory in all early learning and childcare programs. And while there is an additional $150,000 included in this agreement for that work, we also have Supporting Child Inclusion and Participation Funding, or SCIP, you may have heard of, which is a $1.7 million territorial budget. Next slide. In speaking to quality, and this aligns with both what we heard in the funding review and in the engagement on development of the strategy, the Agreement and Action Plan speaks to gathering baseline data on wages this fiscal year, so we have a better understanding of where we're starting from, with a range from $18 to $22 an hour for center-based staff throughout the territory, and then looks to create a wage grid with an implementation plan within the life of the agreement. Again, because change takes time and we want to do it well, we're going to take the next couple of years to look at planning for that and implement in years 4 and 5. We'll also be creating a certification process for early childhood educators beginning in 22-23, and that has a target of 30% of educators certified by the end of this agreement and 60% by the end of our strategy's implementation. We also have a retention incentive where we recognize educators are paid lower wages in centers and we want to provide something to them sooner, but we want to plan well for the wage grid. So in the meantime, we'll provide an incentive to get at an increase in wages in years 2 and 3, so starting 22-23 fiscal, before the systemic approach is implemented. And we are also trying to get at quality by working with programs to implement a pilot of our early learning framework, which is an overarching document to guide the types of early learning that's happening in programs. The total 2-year investment in this area is estimated at $1.07 million for 21-22 and 22-23. And again, adjustments will be made accordingly because of the later implementation, but no funds are lost. Next slide. This second to last slide speaks to the need for increased reporting. So where it's a significant investment from the federal government, an additional $51.1 million added to the system, we also have additional data gathering and reporting requirements. We're going to work with our licensed programs to improve how we're asking for the data and how we're reporting it back to the federal government, so we're meeting our requirements but not placing an unnecessary burden on programs. We're providing some funding related to the childcare fee reduction subsidy to acknowledge the additional administrative work required for that, but also looking at how to streamline it and minimize what we're asking for. And any additional new data requirements are also being incrementally addressed over the first few years of the agreement, where we can look at development of an IT framework or support system so that it's easy to capture the information from programs and not too onerous. And then we will have development of a census by next March, or an annual survey, and that information will be really invaluable to inform what we're doing and help make the best possible changes for the system. And then that work will be used ongoing. Next slide. Thank you. So in terms of next steps, we really look forward to the discussion part of this meeting and the feedback from committee. We're also in the midst of meeting with licensed programs. With the announcement last Thursday, we are beginning to have information sessions. We held one on Saturday, two on Saturday, one for family day homes and one for center-based programs, and we will have another two tomorrow evening with additional meetings as required with licensed programs individually to make sure we address all of their questions and support them in implementing the different areas of focus included in the action plan. We will be merging the two action plans from the two agreements into one action plan so that hopefully it's easier for us to communicate and work with partners around this work. And we will also be working to implement both agreements so that we can support the strategy overall, which reflects the voices of the people throughout the territory that participate in engagement. Thank you. And next slide is just our appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Caprillion and Minister Simpson, for the presentation. We really appreciate it and appreciate you taking the time. I'm going to turn the floor over to members right away for questions, and I'm going to open the floor up first to MLA Semler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the questions that I have concern, and hopefully that I can get a clearer picture on within this funding and how it's going to help. Because I know according to the presentation, sorry, I just got to get my notes back up. There's the inclusion targets that are going to be set. So under that, I'd like to know and how vulnerable and equity seeking families. Because one of the things that, you know, coming into this house, one of the first things that we had to tackle was the Auditor General report on, you know, our education. And one of the big things in there was that our Indigenous population, our low-income families are less likely to graduate. Our small communities are less likely to graduate. Sitting on a school board, we always, every year, we try to figure out ways on how we're going to tackle the grade 10 bottleneck from when they go from up to grade 9, and then they have to hit the credit courses and they can't pass. So I know a lot of work has been focused on early child and developing, providing that access to early child development to all children of the Northwest Territories, and especially, targeting the area where we have our vulnerable and our low-income families, our Indigenous families. That how is this going to help them? Like when I look at the numbers from EC&E and income support, we have a lot of families that might be funded by income support. But if you're looking at it as a childcare and they go to income support to get funding to put their child in childcare, if they're a stay-at-home mom or another parent is home, then they don't qualify for those funds to pay for the childcare, and they're already vulnerable. They're already in a program seeking vulnerable funds. So how is the department working? Like EC&E falls under you, income support falls under EC&E, so early childhood falls under this. So how are we going to bridge that gap so these children are able to access equitable daycare like any other kid in the Northwest Territories that's in a current facility where their parents can afford it or afford 50%? Because those are the kids that we're going to be worried about that are not going to succeed. So that's my question, and I hope I can get some clarification, some answers, even if it's down the road. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, MLA Semler. Minister?
Thank you, and I appreciate the member bringing this up, and a number of members have raised this assembly, and I think we're on the same page. Whenever I think about how we can make the biggest impact, it is with those populations who need that assistance. There are some children who, they're getting read to every night. They have all the advantages in the world, and there's others who don't. And so, how do we help that population? And the member is correct that that ECE is responsible for income assistance, and luckily we're doing a review of that. And so her comments have been noted in that review to ensure that price, even at $10 a day, isn't a barrier to anyone. And in terms of the specifics about inclusion and really what that means in this context as well, I can get Ms. Kapralian to provide some more technical details on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Ms. Kapralian?
In terms of equity seeking and vulnerable, I'm sure we brought this to committee before, so aware, the early development instrument will be used to assess vulnerabilities on track and at-risk rates for children who are attending school, and that will give us a snapshot retroactively of the system, and we'll track those trends over time. We're also looking to increase access because where there's unmet demand, we know that if you're already accessing a space, you'll benefit from affordability, but if you're not accessing a space, you can't. So once we increase access in communities, hopefully that will also help families access it, in addition to what the minister spoke of around income and lower income in particular being addressed. And then we have some integrated services delivery work that is a shared mandate item, which will help address inclusion supports more broadly.
Thank you, Ms. Kapralian. Emily Semler, do you have a follow-up question?
Thank you. Way back when I used to work in public health, I was part of a committee that restructured we used to use the Nipissing, which is an assessment tool for all of our children that go in to see the public health nurse. So anybody who has kids, they do the development testing, and we revamped that to specifically to kind of tune it to NWT, and that was under Northwest Territories Health and Social Services now, so they continue to do that. Is there a way, and I'm looking at some of these different little programs, that children who are not meeting those targets, and say if families are going into public health and the children are not meeting those targets, is there a way to refer them into the early childhood for scholarships or certain programs so that they're higher priority into some of these early childhood programs, and they get funded for this, so that way eliminates the barrier, and it's kind of like that one window approach, especially when you're think about health centers. It's the nurse that does it all. She doesn't have the time to run to do an emergency when she's doing her well child. If she can take that form and the child doesn't pass, to send it somewhere so that someone's going to contact that parent to see if they can work with them to get them into some type of childcare support with this funding that we can get, because then we are targeting our vulnerable and our most at need. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Emily Semler. Minister?
Thank you, and I believe that's actually the mandate of this government is to do that exact work that the member is speaking about, because we see the value in that, and I'm not sure if the Deputy Minister wants to add something.
Mr. McDonald?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and that's exactly right. Under the mandate commitment to improve early childhood outcomes, there is a commitment across social envelope departments to work more closely together to enhance how we're communicating about early childhood outcomes. So as Ms. Kapralian mentioned, and as the member mentioned, child checks can allow us to understand in real time where children are in terms of their development. In the long term, the early development instrument allows us to look at changes over time to understand whether large-scale investments such as this are having an impact on that population. But it's through that integrated service delivery work that allows us to develop a work plan on how to share information more effectively, where to look for gaps, and that work is underway. So Health and Social Services, ECE, Justice, for example, are all involved in that work to try to figure out how we can improve some of that information sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Minister, I will now pass the virtual floor over to Emily Knockleby.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Frantically looking for all my buttons to unmute, etc. I appreciate the department and the minister presenting to us after such a long day for most of us. I am going to then try to do justice to some information that has been provided to me by some people or some residents that have some concerns around how this is being laid out. So I'm just, sorry, 1 second here, finding my mail. So it's my understanding that that this strategy is based on what we heard report, as well as the funding program review, which identified the teacher, the professional staff and wages and their wages and credentials as being sort of the number one concern. However, the strategy seems to be based around affordability first. And I guess where I'm going with this is there seems to be a concern that from people that are more in the know than me, that we're doing things backwards, so that perhaps and that we're actually restricting how the daycare spaces are able to operate and their own decision-making authorities or abilities, and therefore that kind of puts them in a situation of being responsible for some things such as the fees that they then can't control. So I'm just wondering if the minister and the department can speak a little bit to this concern about why we're not doing the professional piece first and are looking at the fees to begin with. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Knockleby. Minister?
Thank you. And I can say that we have a plan to do everything, and we could have, I mean, one of the options could have been to just reduce fees to $10 a day right off the bat. But we recognize that there's a lot of work to be done before we get to that point. And fees are the thing people are interested in. So I think that might be what catches people's attention and what I might highlight to get people's attention, because people are going to be saving thousands of dollars a year, which is, you know, a rare thing to happen in this day and age, that all of a sudden now you're saving $5,000, maybe $10,000 a year. So that's why we spend so much time talking about the fees. But really, there's a lot of work already going into advancing the workforce. There are programs being offered at the college. There are programs being offered at College Nordique in French First Language programs. And we definitely understand the need to expand those offerings. And as we transform the college as well, we'll be able to get out into more communities. And so all of that is part of the plan. As well, we've talked about the wage enhancements, and there's things like that we already do. We already provide wage enhancements to early learning and childcare providers, and so those are the things we can easily roll out because there's already existing programs. So I'm not sure if the Deputy Minister wants to add anything to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. McDonald?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And really appreciate the question and the concerns about what comes first and what may be, you know, at a cost to that, what may have to wait. This strategy and this action plan more specifically are really grounded in large part by the federal agreement. And that federal agreement is based on some federal priorities for a national childcare system or program. So in terms of finalizing that agreement, we had to ensure that from a planning perspective, we could meet the federal terms in order to actually reach an agreement and sign. So I think in large measure, those terms drove some of the decision making around what we could do first, what constraints we had to work with. 51.1 million is a significant injection of funding for us, and we're extremely excited about that, but we can't do everything at once. And as the Minister indicated, there are certain things that we could do quickly, other things that we know will take much more time. As Ms. Caprellian mentioned earlier, some change, such as developing a certification system, will take time. And as she mentioned in the presentation earlier, it's really important for us to, now that we're able to announce this and get out and do the work and work with partners, we really have to hear from them and once again understand how to adjust this action plan going forward over the 5-year time horizon. So I hope that helped clarify a little bit around some of the constraints that we were dealing with. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Emily Knockleby, do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, so it's probably good that you had the Deputy Minister go after you because, with all respect, my comment was going to be that this seems like a vote grab or a cabinet making everybody feel good about them type decision to then increase the fees, or sorry, to decrease the fees right away. And it's not to say that I don't want our residents to have some immediate savings. But, you know, when the daycare providers are saying this isn't the right order, you know, that's concerning to me, because are we sacrificing, you know, a long-term better plan and better movement forward just for a quick saving so that residents are happy, which I get why people we want to make people happy. But when the deputy minister then says that that's tied to the way the federal funding has come, then I just now pass that same comment on to the federal government, that it seems again that this is a way to buy Canadians' votes by putting those restrictions on the funding and ensuring that, you know, that it goes straight into the pockets of Canadians, which again, I'm not advocating against, but I worry that now we're seeing a vote grab basically dictating how this goes versus what the daycare providers are saying to us. So I know that was a really long comment on that, and I do have another question. So if you want to let me have one now, I'll take it. And if not, I'll go back on the list. Thank you, Madam Chair.
No, Emily Knockleby, if you want to ask your follow-up as part of your comment, please go ahead. And then if you have a third question, then I'll put you back on the list.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do appreciate that. And I do appreciate that the government or the GNWT has restrictions on this. I guess the next question I have is around attendance and going to an attendance, non-attendance based fee. It's been my understanding that while COVID was occurring and attendance was fluctuating, and I know this is more applicable to the Yellowknife ridings, but that's where I'm from, so I got to bring this up, that the operational costs are essentially fixed for a building, so it really doesn't matter from an operations standpoint how many children are in that building. It's still going to take the same amount of money to run it. So can the minister and the department maybe speak a little bit to why we're moving away from that, and if there's potential that it doesn't work across the board but is better for small communities? Is there a way to have a hybrid model and stop treating Yellowknife the same as everywhere else? Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Knockleby. Minister?
Thank you. I can assure everyone that the attendance-based model is not just a concern in Yellowknife, but I've heard that from around the territory. And this is prior to COVID. It's not related necessarily to COVID. This has been a long-standing issue. I've heard comments that it is administratively burdensome. And so we are looking at other ways to provide that funding. And this was happening before the federal agreement. There was an awareness of this, and we were undertaking a review of our programs, and this was one that was easily identifiable as one that needed some changes. So that work is underway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Next on my list, I have Emily Whalen Armstrong.
Okay, thank you. I just want to ask about speech and language pathologists. I'm sure most of you are probably teachers, and you taught in some of the northern school, and you've seen there are some kids, some of our kids, some of the small community kids enter school with no language skills. So the first year is focused on developing that skills. So the first year of their being in school, a lot of the students, they miss out on the basic. So they're falling behind in a lot of cases. So I just wanted to ask if one of the things that this new childcare program will focus on is the speech and language pathologist, because in Cleachville region, we haven't had any speech and language pathologists since 4 years, I think. I don't know if I'm exaggerating or not, but we haven't had any. And so I just want to know if that will be one of the focus for this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Whalen Armstrong. Minister?
Thank you. And so the funding that was mentioned earlier by Ms. Capralian, the SKIP funding, and what that stands for right now escapes me, but that existing funding can be used by early childhood centers to contract services like this to help those children. And because one of the focuses is on inclusivity, that means inclusive to all children, regardless of their needs. And so there was a focus on ensuring that we help those students or those children as well. So yes, this is something that we acknowledge and are working to address through this plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Emily Whalen Armstrong?
He was a teacher. He was nodding. And there's quite a few teachers, I think, in here too, so I recognize some. So, yes, that will be good, that's going to help a lot of our young people. So, because I think one of your focus is that leaving no child behind. So I think this is where we're going to make some, progress in this area. And so that's what I was mainly concerned about, is about speech and language pathologists. And I want to ask, what about those communities that do not have, how are you going to accommodate those communities that you identify? I think you said 11 or 13 communities that do not have childcare. How are you going to accommodate them with this fund? Thank you.
Thank you, MLA Whalen Armstrong. Minister?
Thank you, and it all depends on the reason that those communities don't have childcare. So in some communities, there's no children under the age of 5, and there's no need for childcare for children 5 and younger in those communities. In other communities, there may be a lack of infrastructure. And so we have our Early Childhood Infrastructure Fund, $1 million annually. We also have a number of other pots of money that childcare centers can apply for to help get started up, to help purchase equipment and supplies that are needed. So there's a number of ways that we can do that, but we need to work with people because the government doesn't run childcare centers. And so we need those nonprofits, we need the Indigenous governments on board so that we have operators. And there are other pots of money for Indigenous government through the federal government. So if we can assist those governments in attracting some of those dollars as well, we're happy to do that. So those are some of the ways, but again, there's different reasons in each of those communities why they don't have childcare, and so we need to look at them individually. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Next on my list, I have MLA O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks for the presentation. I guess at this point, how adjustable is this plan? You've already signed an agreement that kind of says you've got to deliver on these areas like accessibility, inclusion, quality, increased reporting, affordability. So how adjustable is the plan at this point? Thanks, Madam.
Thank you, MLA O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, and I can say that, first of all, Shelley and her team put in a lot of work on this, and the federal government did as well. And it was through those many, many negotiations and back and forths that the federal government came to realize that we do need some flexibility. And so while there are targets in the agreement, and there are some actions, there's a lot of flexibility within those actions. We have to hit the targets, but how we get there is largely up to us. So perhaps the Deputy Minister can add some more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And the Minister is absolutely correct. There are key targets that the federal government, as mentioned earlier, is looking for from provinces and territories in exchange for the provision of this funding. Examples under our agreement include the increase to licensed spaces within the territory over a prescribed amount of time. So that's one measure that they're looking for. How we get there, we have some flexibility in terms of how we can make that happen given our circumstances, which we, as the Minister mentioned, through our negotiations made clear to them. One other example in the agreement itself was they recognize that our early childhood sector is not in the same starting place as would be the case in New Brunswick or British Columbia, as an example. So we were able to negotiate an 85% carry forward provision where we can take funds from one year, bring them forward to the next year. And what that allows us to do is provide funding in the short term, but save that money as we do some of our planning and rolling out some of our programs, and as we mentioned earlier, work with licensed programs and family day home operators to meet their needs as well through this process. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Minister, MLA O'Reilly.
Yeah, okay. No, thanks for that. I think at least a couple of areas that I would like to suggest then that you look at in terms of the timelines are, I think this pay grid certification issue, if there's any way to speed that up, that would be really helpful. Because I think the longer we put that off, the more staff we're going to lose. And that's going to put some of the daycare operators at risk. And I think because that's one of the key things that needs to be fixed. So that's one. The second one that I'm kind of very worried about, and I raised it in the House with the minister on the floor, is the need for infrastructure dollars. I know there's $1 million a year, but $1 million is not going to build a daycare in a community that wants one. It might help modify some space, but it's not going to build a daycare. So we got to find a way to, I know you got to work with different partners, different capacities and whatever, but if there's any way to increase that amount of money, or at least have it so that if it's used up quickly in a year, that there's some more that people can draw on, maybe have 2 calls a year or something, or 3 calls a year for the funding, and maybe some planning study money as part of that. Because what I'm worried about is the places that have daycares are going to get an advantage right away over the places that don't have one. And that's going to create inequity, and that's not, I think, where we need to go, particularly for the smaller communities that don't have daycares. Not all of them want one necessarily, but we've got to find a way to adjust this so that it's a more equitable approach, and particularly for those places that don't have one. So anyways, there's a couple of areas that I really want to suggest to you that you need to look at some other kinds of timelines or flexibility here. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MLA O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you. I note those comments, and I have similar concerns to the member. So I know that a lot of work has gone into this, and there's reasons why certain things are scheduled at certain times. But I have the same concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Next on my list, I have MLA Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Your light's on now. You're good.
Oh.
Your light's back on.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, in talking to people in Hay River, and I think there might be some confusion because we talk about regulated spaces and then we've got unregulated spaces. So people are asking, I guess, is kind of what's the difference and how much more work will go into requiring a place, an existing place maybe to be deemed regulated. And people are concerned about the paperwork. Everything always sounds rosy until at the end of the day we start looking at how much work goes into determine how we can get a facility set up properly. We got to train people. Like it's a big thing. And in Yellowknife and regional centers it might be not so bad, but when you start to move into the communities, it gets a lot more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, MLA Simpson. Minister?
Thank you. And so licensed spaces, they do have to meet all the requirements in the legislation. An unlicensed space, it doesn't. It also doesn't receive any funding. And that's the current funding that exists as well as any of the future funding that we're rolling out. And there are reasons why there are those requirements, and they're pretty standard across Canada. I think there would be a bit of an outcry if we said, we don't necessarily need fire to ensure there's safe premises for children and things like that. But that's why we provide funding to help people who want to get into this business make those changes. I'm not sure, perhaps Ms. Kapralian wants to speak to this a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Ms. Kapralian?
Thank you. As the Minister mentioned, we do have health and safety funding up to $10,000 to address deficiencies during the licensing process. We have our new childcare spaces funding, which is a startup amount that's based on the number and type of licensed spaces, and that's given to programs to purchase resources and materials to support an early learning, high quality early learning environment. Our regional early childhood consultants are essential in terms of supporting licensed programs to work through that process and support them along the way, so that hopefully when they're meeting with our staff, they understand that it might seem like a lot, but as we work through it together, there's a pre-inspection inspection process that's also designed to be supportive, so that we have meetings up front and walk through what's required before the actual inspection takes place. So there's a number of ways that we've tried to look at how we can support both with funding, in-kind support, staff, that kind of thing to address it. And as the Minister was mentioning, early childhood program operating subsidy funding, the attendance-based funding we've mentioned here this evening. The way it currently exists is only accessible for licensed programs. So there's a lot of benefits to becoming licensed, and ultimately the goal is to ensure the safety of children when they're in the care of others. So where programs are interested in becoming licensed, we're very eager to speak with them and work with them and support them in doing that. If there's a need around building and funding for that, we would explore that with them as well.
Thank you, Ms. Caprillion. Emily Simpson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And with this, how much of this is going to be, if not already embedded in legislation or regulations set out in that, and how or what's required for a regulated childcare facility? Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Simpson. Minister?
Thank you, and it is set out in the Act and the regulations, and perhaps Ms. Caprillion can speak to some of those specifics. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Ms. Caprillion?
Thank you. Yes, there are requirements, including the number of staff per child. There are requirements that are also in other acts, so the environmental health and the fire. So we work with MACA and Health and Social Services, and between our three departments try to streamline the licensing process so that it's as smooth as possible. And for primary staff and center-based programs, there's also an educational requirement, but we recognize that we're at a certain point in developing our system. So for our primary staff that may not have formal post-secondary, we work to develop a plan around that and support them in achieving and meeting that. So that links into our certification system over the next few years. For example, I don't know if that answers the member's question.
Thank you, Ms. Caprillion. Next on my list, I have Emily Knockleby.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My next question is just again around this idea of the living wage for the early childcare workers. How much does the department estimate it's going to cost to bring all the current workers up to a living wage? Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Knockleby. Minister?
Thank you. I'd like to hand that off to, I guess, Ms. Caprillion.
Thank you, Minister. Ms. Caprillion?
So the current wage that most center-based staff receive is between $18 and $22 an hour. And we recognize there's a gap when we think about the other professional opportunities there are for educators, and that's part of the recruitment and retention issue that we're seeing. So we're investing with the retention incentive over the next 2 years, an amount that I will look up quickly that was in the presentation. And that amount will move us towards a wage that hopefully will be within will be a reasonable amount that will allow people to stay in the system and work and be able to live their lives and not pursue other careers. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop talking and just look for the number. I apologize.
No, thank you.
Ms. Caprillion, we understand this.
Only a Monday, but it's been a very long Monday for many, so much appreciated. Emily Knockleby, I'll pass the floor back to yourself.
Yeah, I would say that's on me for missing that in the presentation. I am just trying to somewhat keep it together here as we approach our 12th hour or so, 11th. Yeah, I mean, I'll look for that number and have a look. I guess my question would be is, it sounds like we're going to be at least waiting another year, 2 years for this to actually roll out, where we'll see workers with that money in their hands. And when I hear that we're paying $18 to $22 an hour, and I'm well aware of that, gosh, like 13 years ago, cleaning staff at Giant Mine was making $25 to $30 an hour. So, and that wasn't even enhanced cleaning at the time because nobody seemed to care. So, I really struggle with that. We think it's okay to put some of our children that we're not investing better in our workers that are with our children throughout the day. So I'm not sure if that's really a question there, but sorry, I had a question. Is there a way that the GNWT could cover the gap in providing just immediately that top up to a living wage ahead of this program implementation, and just maybe some sort of a one-time funding or whatever until we can get these workers up in the actual plan? Because I'm concerned from what I'm hearing from people that this is way too long to wait, and that drain that we're going to see is going to be, insurmountable by the time the top up or whatever it's called rolls out. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Knockleby. Minister?
Thank you. So that's exactly what we're doing. Until we can get the wage grid in place, there will be incentives sort of in a lump sum. So not an hourly increase, but there will be incentives. And that's already done now based on education. So if someone has a certain level of education, ECE actually provides them with additional funding each year. And so what we're doing, what we're proposing is to increase that, understanding that it is a long time to wait before we have a wage grid in place. So I think it's about 1.07 million we will be investing in the upcoming fiscal year in that in those wages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Next on my list, I have MLA O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So, as much as I said, I think you got to give a higher priority to the pay grid and infrastructure or capital issues. One thing that I'm starting to hear a little bit of concern around is this refunding of the $50% of the childcare fees between January and March 31st. And how is that actually going to work? I guess I'd like to know more about is each licensed childcare provider being given some sort of administrative money to, do bookkeeping to figure out how much each family is supposed to get back, or is it a lump sum that they're paid? Is it per child, or how's that going to work? And if a child care provider doesn't want to sign up, what is it the parents can do to access the money if their child care provider won't do it? Like with the wage top-up program, I know it's a completely different department, different thing, but if an employer didn't enroll, an employee could still go directly to Department of Finance and get the wage top-up by providing pay stubs. So is there a way that, the individual receipts could be provided for reimbursement? So anyways, I know it's a populist move to try to get the money out quickly, but it's going to create a real administrative nightmare that I think needs to get sorted out, and I'd like to hear how that's going to work. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you. And as I said before, this was done in 2020 with the funding for COVID when there was a supplement. And I will say right off the bat that the feds have been clear that the GNWT is not providing money to parents. And so if a child care center doesn't want to opt into this program, then the parents will not receive that retroactive funding. However, I think if someone cares about childcare and cares about putting money back in parents' pockets, they will opt in. And that's why we're providing them with that additional financial support to help them go through, find out which parents are eligible for that funding and provide it back to the parents. And so for some details on how that's going to work, because this is the big question that child care providers are interested in, I can ask Ms. Kapralian to speak to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Ms. Kapralian?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the onset of implementing this fund, if programs opt in, they would complete a template that we've designed and will be sharing with programs soon, following our information sessions to help them understand how to fill it out. We've tried to design it in a way that streamlines it as much as possible, so it'll include the family names, the age of the child, so we know that they're eligible and are 5 years of age and younger, and the fees charged for each month that the child attended care. We'll calculate the amount that they're provided. It will be given to the program for the period of January to March to reimburse to families. Recognizing, as the minister said, that that is work up front for programs that have already received funds from families, we are providing an administrative amount that will be given to them for the period of January to March and ongoing to acknowledge that there is work involved in delivering this funding. However, going forward, we anticipate that from April onward, where families will have a reduced amount that they pay the program and ECE will provide the difference, that will require maintaining the list. So some programs might have higher turnover, let's say in the end of summer, where some children might be shifting to school-based programming. And so then that might require some changes to the registration or template, but otherwise it would be a matter of confirming to ECE that that same list applies and is true for that month. We flow the money in advance to the programs and they're able to reduce funds before parents even pay it to them. So I think going forward will be hopefully a lot easier. We did hear from programs around implementation during COVID, as Minister mentioned, and we've given that thought in designing this program. So our hope is that programs will experience this differently.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kapralian. Emily O'Reilly.
Okay, thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks for that. I'll go in way over my head. Is the admin amount going to be like a straight percentage on this template? Is it like 10%, 15%? How's the admin amount actually going to be calculated to support this rebate stuff? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Emily O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you. So we are right now, as Ms. Kapralian mentioned earlier, meeting with the centers, and so we need to understand their needs. And so once we understand their needs, then we can determine how much to provide them with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Members, is there anyone else for a second round of questions before I move to third round of questions? Emily Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You had mentioned, signing the agreement with the federal government. There was, sounded like there may have been a few stumbling blocks. Is there any limitations within that agreement that you feel will kind of surface? And if so, how are you going to deal with them, or have you identified anything, or is everything pretty well clear cut? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily Simpson. Minister?
Thank you. I mean, the best laid plans are only plans, so there could be something, but perhaps the Deputy Minister can make some comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As mentioned previously, the negotiations were extensive in terms of reaching an agreement on their terms and what the GNWT believed was realistic and achievable given our context and the current state of the early childhood sector in the Northwest Territories. So I think we think that they're, for lack of a better term, doable. But every year we are obligated to provide an annual report and publish it on our website, and Canada will publish it as well on theirs. And we also have a bilateral committee where, for example, the Director of Early Learning and Childcare can meet with their federal counterpart and work to adjust. So each year, as we renew our action plans, we will work with Canada to provide them updates on where we might be running into impediments that perhaps could not be foreseen, and then basically work towards adjusting the plan accordingly. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. Emily Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The other question, I guess, is around something that usually we're not very good at doing, and that's communication. And you did mention it, and you're doing something with providers now, rolling out information. Does that include out into the small communities since COVID has stopped or slowed down travel? So will we have people going into the communities to actually communicate to potential providers or providers how this is rolling out? Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Simpson. Minister?
Thank you. Yes, that work has already begun. We have early childhood coordinators in all the regions, and they have relationships with all of the licensed childcare centers, and those conversations with them have started, and the travel is necessary because part of being a licensed center are, inspections are part of that. And so we send people out to do those inspections. So there will be travel and there will be discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. MLA is in the room. Does anybody else have a second set? Seeing none, MLA Nakopi. Oh, MLA Whalen Armstrong, do you have a second set?
Katrina first.
Thank you, MLA Whalen Armstrong. MLA Nakopi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, MLA Whalen Armstrong. My next question is, given the overall total funding that we're being provided, what's the proportion that's going to the reduction of fees versus the infrastructure versus increasing wages? Thank you.
Thank you, MLA Nakopi. Minister?
Thank you. And so that changes year over year. I'm not sure who has that information on hand right now.
I don't think we have the percentages broken out here at this time, but we could provide that.
So maybe Ms. Kapralian can speak generally to it. We don't have it in percentages, but we have some numbers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Ms. Kapralian.
So about half, more than half, a significant portion is going to the childcare fee reduction subsidy, wages to a lesser extent, access, which is, so I would say it's subsidy, the childcare fee reduction subsidy, then wages, then accessibility, because infrastructure is either funded territorially or through the existing bilateral. And I think once you see the merged action plan that we're preparing in May, it will be easier to see the investment, and the areas of investment will be provided together, so you can see the complete picture easier. And I hope for committee and members of the public, it will make it easier to understand and for us to communicate and answer questions, whereas now it's kind of separated out artificially. And I apologize, I don't have the percentages at hand, but we could look to the Minister.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kapralian. Emily Nakobi, do you have a follow-up question?
Yep. Thank you, Madam Chair. And yeah, anytime you just want to get back to me. I know sometimes that's easier than trying to be on the spot answering something. I guess my next question is around the infrastructure spend. I totally recognize that the reason sometimes we can't look at just, absolute numbers of, say, children is because, what's needed, say, in Colville Lake for the smaller population of children or students early childhood positions is not going to be the same as Yellowknife. So I'm curious what's sort of going to be the decision-making matrix or criteria for infrastructure projects when, say we're looking to spend $1 million in Yellowknife, and that's going to mean, 200 spaces, and I'm totally making these numbers up, versus $1 million to, create significantly less spaces in a smaller community. And again, not saying that one should be preferenced over the other, but I'm curious to know how, if the government has thought through, or the department has thought through how that decision will be made, so that at the time, it's not us regular members, and I know this might be next term, but not fighting amongst ourselves sort of over this pot and having to have this fight again and again and again, and instead having a criteria that the department has developed to look at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily Nakobi. Minister?
Thank you. So we currently have the Early Childhood Infrastructure Fund, and there is a policy that states that we are going to prioritize the small communities and communities without early learning and childcare centers. And I wish the member's example of 200 spaces for $1 million was realistic, but you can't build that in Yellowknife for $1 million. But we are trying to prioritize small communities, and every application is different. And so there are criteria within that, within the infrastructure fund, and not all applicants meet that criteria. So we do try to fund everything that we can. But some are outside of that scope, but we do prioritize the small communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Next on my list, I have before I go to the next person, Minister, can I confirm that I have a commitment for the percentages both on the overall program and by year?
Yes, we can get that for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you for that commitment. Next, I'll pass the floor over to MLA Whalen Armstrong.
Okay. Thank you. So how's the funds going to be allocated to the communities? Because in Klitschko region, we have daycares. Is Klitschko going to be getting any of this funds?
Thank you very much, MLA Whalen Armstrong. Minister.
Yeah, the money goes to licensed childcare centers. So if there's a licensed childcare center, then the funding will flow to that center based on however many children are in that center. There are some childcare centers that don't charge fees. They're generally run by Indigenous governments, and so in those instances we can't reduce fees because the fees are zero, and so we're going to have to work with those centers to figure out how we can better support them to better develop their workforce, provide additional services to help in terms of inclusivity. So there are other ways that we're going to work with centers that don't charge any fees at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. MLA Whalen Armstrong.
Thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you. No, it's, yes, our daycare is open to everybody that's, living in the regions, in the communities. So I wanted to ask that, yes, so if there was any, like whether it's my region or not, but once the money is allocated and many of those facilities in the in the regions, they're all aging. It's old buildings that, that are being used for childcare. So if there's any money that are not used, is there any funds available or going to be available that we can use so that we can access to build a new building or anything like that in the outlying communities?
Thank you very much, MLA Whalen Armstrong. Minister.
Thank you. And so we have as I've stated, the $1 million a year Early Childhood Infrastructure Fund, and that, we do accept applications as well for repairs and retrofits on centers, as well as building new centers. The federal government also has additional funds that they flow directly to Indigenous governments, and then there could be other streams as well. But from the GNWT, our primary mechanism is the Early Childhood Infrastructure Fund. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Members, does anybody else have any questions for the Minister or the Department? Seeing none, I'll ask a couple of really quick questions just based on what I'm hearing from constituents. I know some of them have been asked here today. One of the big concerns I've heard about is turnaround time from the department to day home providers. There's a lot of overhead cost when running a business, and providing for children. Even food these days is a huge cost, and so there is concern over day home providers supporting the program and then having to carry the costs of operating the day home. And so I'm wondering if the department can speak a little bit about the turnaround time and how those funds make it to the day home providers so that they can cover costs of continuing to operate as self-employed people. Thank you.
Thank you. So the refunds from January to March, no one's going to have to carry those costs. That will be, once we find those numbers, then we will flow the money to centers who will then flow it to the parents. And as of April 1st, the contribution agreement should be in place and the money should be flowing to operators. And so they shouldn't have to worry about covering any overhead costs. On the first of the month, they should receive their money, and then they can charge parents at a reduced rate because they will already have the money, the other half of that money in their pockets. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. So just to confirm, there is no lag between, the first of the month and when this money makes it into childcare provider pockets.
That's correct.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Minister.
Thank you. So there's contribution agreements, and so they have to sign the contribution agreements, and based on that, would determine when they get the money. So if they don't sign it if it's not signed by the 1st, then I can't guarantee they're going to get money by the 1st. But as soon as it's signed, the money can start flowing. Thank you.
No, thank you for that, Minister. I know that was a huge concern for day home providers, is being able to continue operations. My next question is, we have heard a lot of different concerns today from MLAs that would be concerns that they're bringing forward from the people that they serve. And so, as this rolls out and people's kind of fears or concerns are addressed and more people maybe join, if it's identified that certain aspects of the program really are not working for the Northwest Territories, is this a living agreement where the department has the flexibility to make adjustments to increase uptake of the program in the territory? So for example, if 3 months in you're finding that 50% of childcare providers are not opting into the program because they have concerns over reporting or administration or anything like that, is there flexibility within the department to address those concerns and adjust the programming? Thank you.
Thank you, and I wanted to say there should be no fear or concern about, there should be no fear regarding this huge injection of money into the early learning and childcare sector. I think it's a good thing, and that's why we're working with the operators to ensure that they don't have those fears, so that, Shelley and her team, they're meeting with the operators on a regular basis. They started last week, they're going to continue to meet this week, and all of their questions should be answered. So I think if we haven't convinced people in a few months, those people are never going to be convinced. I expect that we'll have people who want to participate, we'll have them the information they need to make that decision very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Emily Semler.
Yeah, just one of her questions kind of sparked an opposite reaction in my brain, so I wanted to ask it here is, and I'm sure with this contribution agreements, the licensed day homes, the daycare centers, I'm sure they're all going to follow and do what they do, but I'm going to be the person that says, what if it doesn't happen? And then there's a parent or a child that's getting the contribution agreement but is now, well, all the other costs are, inflation for instance is happening as we speak, so now they raise all their costs, so now parents are not seeing that deduction in their fees. And I'm not saying that, but one person does it and then it's going to cause a problem, because people are going to start to fear that your childcare, I go in and this is I usually pay this much every month and it's supposed to be half of that, but I'm paying still 75% or 80%, so where is there something in place to make sure when we sign the contribution agreements that these are the numbers we're submitting, then this is the contribution agreement, and so it should reflect, and if there isn't, are parents able to call somewhere or do something to ensure that this is happening? Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Semler. Minister?
Thank you, and this is why we have to ensure that we cooperate and we have good relationships with the childcare centers. The fee reduction initially is 50% on average, so that's the average of the costs across the territory. And so it doesn't mean that someone is going to see a 50% reduction if the cost is more than
Our maximum.
at the maximum. But fees do go up, or costs do go up. We see them rise now, and even with this in place, we will see them rise. But you highlight why relationships are so important, and the Deputy Minister can speak to this because a lot of thought has gone into it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As the Minister mentioned, relationships will be critical. So we really don't believe that there will be very many programs who ultimately opt out of this funding. It's good news for them, it's good news for their clients, it's good news for the territory. So it's kind of one of those win-win-win situations. The contribution agreement, as mentioned previously, is the mechanism that we'll be using to flow the money out. So the contribution agreement, as well as all of the existing funding that EC provides, will have terms in it like it would for any other government contribution agreement. So if a recipient does not abide by the terms of the agreement, then we'll have the authority to withhold funding and so on and so forth. So as with any other agreement of that nature, there are mechanisms there. But in all honesty, the Early Learning and Childcare Division, the regional offices and the ECCs within them, they're there to support. It's not a stick, it's a carrot, and they're there to support our partners and help our partners work through this change, because it is systemic change. So I'll leave it at that, but thank you, Madam Chair.
Very much, Mr. McDonald. Emily Semler.
Okay, so one of the things you said is that it's an average, So not every person's going to see a 50% reduction. So if I'm a childcare operator, I'm going to get it asking the question from the parent saying, well, why isn't my fee reduced by 50%? And if I'm the parent, you know, I'm going to be going at the childcare provider saying, you're ripping me off. And I'm just kind of laying it how it would be. So is that, because from me sitting here and all the presentations we had and the announcement that was made, it was going to decrease childcare by 50%. So I don't have kids in care, like in childcare. They're 26 and 17, so I'm done paying childcare, so I won't have that problem. But the parents that do, and especially if they have multiple children, and if it's not 50%, how is this going to be communicated to the territory now that it's been communicated that it's a 50% reduction? Because not everywhere is going to get 50%, you said. So thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like that clarified, and if not today, somewhere publicly, because I feel for the childcare providers that are going to not be able to provide 50%. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Semler. Minister?
Thank you. And even though every time I talk about this, I say 50% on average, people tune out after the 50%. So I hear the member's point. It's my concern as well. And so I can let the Deputy Minister speak to it, because this is, again, something that has been thought about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And absolutely, we understand that if, for example, there are questions that are about the agreement, the action plan, or the funding, we don't want to pass that burden on to our partners. ECE, through our website, we have other public points of service or access, such as 1-800 numbers. We also, as mentioned previously, have the early childhood coordinators in each of the regions. So those individuals and those mechanisms are a way for us to promote information and to be available to answer some of those questions, as well as work with the licensed program operators and providers to tell them to redirect people so that they don't have to bear the brunt of those types of questions. So that's really, I think, something that we've done in the past in other situations, and we would do that again. But I would just add that, as with most program changes or new programs, there are lots of questions early on, and that peaks, and then after a certain amount of time, people really start to understand, they see the change, the anxiety dissipates, and the questions really go away at that point. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. Next on my list, I have Emily O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I guess building on something my colleague from Nuvik Twin Lakes, maybe coming at it from a different angle. What if a child care provider would like to access money from EC&E, but they think the best use for that is to build their workforce, rather than provide the 50% rebates to the parents. And they, if it's a nonprofit, they have the majority of the parents on board. Is that an option? For them to use the money to provide better pay for their workers so that they retain the workers, or even use some of the money to maybe make some adjustments in the space that they have that would allow them to create more spaces for their childcare. I guess what I'm trying to go at is each childcare is going to have its own needs. And if there's a way for us to have some flexibility in rolling the money out, and I understand that you have these different metrics that you want everybody to reach, but some of them are at different places. But if there's some flexibility in the use of the money and giving the child care providers maybe a little bit more autonomy in how they use the money, everybody's going to get to the same place, but they're going to get there slightly different ways. Is that a possibility? Or is there that sort of flexibility in even the first round of rollout money, where some of the childcare providers, rather than give the 50% back, maybe retain or use part of it to build their childcare in other ways by providing more spaces or developing their workforce? Thanks.
Thank you, Member Minister Asini.
Thank you. So the federal government, who's providing these funds, have put some strict parameters around it. around reductions. That being said, there is some flexibility, and I can ask Ms. Capralian to speak to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Capri.
When we start having those program-specific conversations, because some contexts are slightly different, and some programs have, as you know, different childcare fees, but some also pay different wages. So we're eager to start those individual conversations above and beyond our info sessions. And the more we have those conversations with programs, the better understanding we have on those realities and those contexts. That will help inform the next 2 years of planning. As it is with the childcare funding reduction subsidy now, those dollars need to be used for affordability. However, in having those individual program level conversations, there may be some programs that are further along in addressing wages, and so we want to understand those program specific realities. And there are specific funding structures in place right now to help in terms of when you said making adjustments to space, so our early childhood infrastructure funding, our health and safety funding, and so on. And so we're looking at those separate pieces of funding and looking at what we heard from the funding review and our conversations in the next 2 years to develop a structure that's kind of complementary and cohesive, I guess, and best meets the needs of programs. So, this depends on the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ms. Capralian. MLA O'Reilly.
I just don't want us to get locked into, I can see where a childcare provider, ends up giving money back to the parents and then has to increase their fees to cover their operating costs in some other way. And so it's a wash. So I don't think we want to go there. So the more flexibility I think you folks have in rolling out the money, the better we can meet the needs of kids, their families, and the residents of the NWT. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, MLA O'Reilly. And next I have MLA Whalen Armstrong.
Okay. So you said that the childcare funds will be allocated based on number of kids that's in care or that's attend. Then the small communities, they're going to be at disadvantage compared to the larger regional center. So I don't know how this is going to fix our problem because the education outcome in the small communities is already poor. Is suffering as it is. I don't think the way that you guys are going to be allocating the fund based on the number of children in care, it's not going to help improve the education outcome in our regions or anywhere else in the small communities as that's in the report, the GNWT statistics. I think it should be based on needs. And then, like right now, how can we get this education outcome better in the small communities? That should be your focus, not on all this whatever that you are suggesting. Is there any way that we can try to get this money go directly to the indigenous government from the federal government instead of going through the government of the Northwest Territories? Because you're telling us what to do, and I don't think a lot of us are happy about that in the small communities.
Thank you, MLA Whalen Armstrong. Minister?
Thank you. So the funding to reduce fees goes to parents. So it's being allocated on a per child basis, in that if a parent has a child in care, the funding will go to the center to reduce the fees to that parent. So that will reduce barriers to for people who can't afford to put their children in childcare. So maybe now we have additional people who can afford to put their children in childcare. There is money going to help develop the workforce so that centers can have qualified staff. It's just like with teachers. There is a big difference between a qualified, experienced teacher and someone who's perhaps not qualified or relatively new. There's a difference in the outcomes of the students, and so investments into the workforce development are going to positively affect the small communities. The funding to ensure that spots are more inclusive, that childcare centers are more inclusive and can provide supports to children who need it will benefit the small communities. So there's going to be benefits across the board. This is an agreement between the Government of Canada and the GNWT, and we don't have the ability to flow money to an Indigenous government for early learning and childcare from this pot of money. It can't happen. However, the federal government does have money, and I believe they have agreements with Indigenous governments where they actually do that. So we are not telling anyone what to do. We are distributing money to help people do what they want to do. Because we don't operate early learning and childcare centers, the government doesn't do that. And so it's the operators who we need to support, and so we need to work with them, and we need to find out what they need and figure out how we can support them, because without them doing what they do, we have no role. So we are not telling people what to do, we're asking how can we help you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Emily Whalen Armstrong.
That's why I said that based on needs, it should be allocated based on needs because, like I said, a lot of our young kids are entering school without no language skills, and we need to focus on that, and then so that way they're not left behind. And it's just that it's a disadvantage for other kids that already have the skills, and they are held back because of some of the kids that don't have that skill. So that's why I'm saying that, one of the focus should be on language development with the early learning and childcare. And that's the only way that we're going to make some improvements. Maybe the education outcome will be better in the small communities. And like Mr. McDonald, who was a teacher, he knows what I'm talking about if he worked in one of the Indigenous community with lots of kids that don't have that skills. So I'm speaking from the Indigenous perspective and for the Indigenous small communities outside of Yellowknife. So that's my only frustration is that the way that funds are that you guys are going to be allocating, and it's going to be disadvantaged because there might not be enough kids that are going to be using or will be eligible. So, and it's going to be, the focus is going to be at the larger center. So that's my only frustrations with this thing. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily Whalen Armstrong. Minister, I know it was a comment. Do you have a response?
Thank you. No need to be frustrated. I have the same thoughts as the member. I've talked about it from the beginning of this assembly with, in terms of the JK-12 system focusing on equity as opposed to, as opposed to the system we have now. So I'm well aware of members' concerns. I have the same concerns, and I think that this is going to benefit everyone, regardless if you're in a small community or in a larger center. And I will say that I know that there were comments about in the Yellowknife perspective. I'm not from Yellowknife, and so I don't necessarily have a Yellowknife perspective. And so I want to assure the member that I'm very concerned about children in small communities, children with developmental needs, children who need additional assistance when they're younger, children who don't have all the benefits that some other children do. And that's always my focus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Emily Nakobi, do you have a follow-up question as well?
I've kind of gone back and forth in my messages to you about whether or not I wanted to ask. I guess I just reiterate the comments around reducing fees across the board. Just, I don't see how that's going to help create new spaces and take, and I know that this is probably not a question and the minister has repeated numerous things this evening, but, how does reducing fees for parents that can afford it, like in Yellowknife with dual income and, good jobs, help those people in the small communities who can't afford it or create new spaces? So again, just a comment that I wanted to reiterate, and I'm not sure if the minister would like to respond again because I know we're all tired, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily Nakobi. Minister?
Thank you. So part of the plan is to create 75 new spaces a year until we get to the 300 new spaces. Not everyone in Yellowknife has dual income. Not everyone in Yellowknife is a married ADM, married couple of ADMs. There are people in Yellowknife who are single parents. There's people in Yellowknife who work jobs where they don't make a living wage, and they need support as well. And so I know there's been lots of concern from the childcare provider side expressed tonight. We also have to think there's also parents who are going to benefit from this. If you have two children, a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old, and you have them in full-time care, you're going to save $11,000 this year. That's a big number, and I think that we need to remember that there are people who are living paycheck to paycheck. My heating bill and power bill this past month were the biggest they've been in years, the biggest they've ever been. Other people are facing those same situations, and so I want everyone to remember that this is money in people's pockets. Is it the plan that is going to create the most spaces? No, but it's not supposed to be the plan to create the most spaces. It's the plan to make childcare affordable and create spaces and develop the workforce. So we're trying to do a lot of things. We're not going to do everything that everyone wants, and not in the timelines. But I think it's still a very exciting time, and I think this is going to make a big difference in the lives of parents and in the lives of children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Minister Emily Knockleby, do you have a follow-up?
I do. So then my next question would be just implement income testing for it so that people that actually need it can qualify for it, and those that don't. And I get that the response will likely be, oh, that's too onerous. But again, if the money had been handed directly to the providers, I think there would be an opportunity for them to have taken care of some of the assessment to determine who are the needy families that could have benefited from the agreement. And so we're not putting the double ADM families, giving them a benefit that they really just don't need. Like, for example, the people that are working at the daycare perhaps need daycare subsidies because they're not making a living wage. So I also just want to say that hear a lot tonight that this is, well, the feds have dictated this. Well, like our housing issue, if we don't have any stock, we're not going to improve the situation because we have nowhere to put everybody. So I just feel that perhaps the negotiations, I wasn't there. I get it's hard. We're not going to turn down money. However, it should have been impressed upon the federal government that the fee reduction was not what the providers were saying was needed right away, was not what the What We Heard report was saying. So, I just feel this is a failure to impress upon the federal government. And given that this is one seat here, I feel like perhaps we could have perhaps just carved out something more unique that fit the territories better. More of a comment and not meant to disparage anybody's hard work. But again, I always come back to we really need our cabinet to be impressing upon the federal government that we are different and that we need things differently done here. And because we're so minuscule compared to the rest of Canada, that there is no reason for the federal government to say no other than administratively. So their buying votes here is useless, and our territory will suffer for it. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily Knockleby. Minister?
Thank you for the comment.
Thank you very much, Minister. Members, noting the time here, it's just after 8:30 p.m. Does anybody else have any additional questions for the Minister or the Department? Seeing and hearing none, first and foremost, I wanted to thank the members of the public who came and joined us here in person today. This is our very first public meeting since March of 2020, so we very much appreciate you taking the time to join us here this evening on such an important topic. I'd like to also thank the Minister as well as the Department of Education, Culture and Employment who took the time to come here this evening and share with committee. I know that we had a lot of questions this evening, but as you can see, childcare is a very important topic to the people of the Northwest Territories, and so we appreciate you taking the time to answer our questions. So thank you for your time this evening. I would also like to thank the members of the public who joined us virtually. So thank you. And I'll ask that committee stay online so that we can go in camera. Thank you.